Dear companions, or should I say in Dutch, lotgenoten. It's time for intergenerational justice. In Dutch this sense works much better because then it rhymes. Het is tijd voor generatiegerechtigheid. I expect to still be there in 2100. Can you imagine how I live in 2100? Can you imagine how we deal with all the IPCC predictions of 3 degrees warming that have come true? How we spend time in cooling houses like in Canada this summer to escape the scorching heat in the summer? How wars are waged over water and food? How we've given climate refugees a place in our neighborhood? Can you imagine how children in school reading back in history books that we knew since the 20th century how terrible climate change would be, but that we miserably failed to keep warming below 1.5 degrees? Dear companions, I expect to be there in 2100, much like your children and perhaps your grandchildren. And what we do today determines what that future will look like. But who thinks about the life in 2100 of me and that of your children and grandchildren? Do the people in the boardrooms care about that future? I've been walking around in the sustainability world in the Netherlands for over 2 years now. And I look with increasing amazement at the way in which we're dealing with the issue. For me, an important question remains unanswered. What is the core purpose of our sustainability activities? Because I think we've completely forgotten about it in practice. And sure, many of you will be able to dream an answer. We all know that well-known definition. The goal of sustainability activities is to build a world in which we can meet the needs of the present without compromising, without depriving future generations of the ability to meet their own needs. You all probably know that Brundtland definition of sustainability. I would summarize that as intergenerational justice, making sure that we don't live at the expense of future generations, but that we support them, based on the conviction that every generation has a non-exchangeable right to well-being, a good quality of life, and a livable world. Every generation. The generations now and the generations in 2100. However, I'm shocked with what I see in practice. During my chairmanship of the Youth Climate Movement, I noticed that intergenerational justice and a livable future in 2100 receives no attention at all in practice. When major decisions are made, the costs and benefits for future generations are rarely taken into account. Whether it's about opening Lelystad Airport, widening the highway A27, or drilling for gas under the Wadden Sea. There's no test done on the effects on the well-being of future generations, on the well-being of your children in 2050, 2070, or 2100. Models or policy packages do not reflect these costs. Hardly any attention is paid to the costs that we burden young and future generations with. The fact that a climate agreement in the Netherlands is not on track is accepted without batting an eyelid. And that, well, every extra ton of CO2 emitted as a result of the delay further increases the, what I call, climate mortgage to young generations. Because they have to get all those megatons out of the air again in the second half of this century. A hugely expensive task. But I never see those costs incorporated into models. In addition, I also never see that every megaton of CO2 that we now emit will cause up to 226 extra deaths until 2100. That is according to a recent study by Columbia University. But even those costs, if you can call it that, I do not see in bills or letters to Parliament. We're not talking about that. Time and again, it is the current interests that matter and not the rights of young and future generations. And this addiction to the present stands in the way of real system change. The protagonists in this transition, the key players, have made it a sport to stick hopeful terms on every adjustment towards a livable future and then hollow it out, without an eye for the end goal. For example, the label climate neutral has been hijacked by aviation companies and oil companies who, with creative accounting and shadowy carbon compensation structures, give us the illusion that you can travel with a clear conscience. We've reduced contributing to a circular economy to mainly just some recycling. Vital core measures, such as less consumption or less growth, are taboo subjects. It is therefore not surprising that our use of raw materials hardly decreases. In circular agriculture, for circular agriculture, the PBL, the Planning Office for the Living Environment, came to the following conclusion. Policy for circular agriculture is mainly aimed at integration into normal business operations. The policy is mainly aimed at integration into normal business operations. This conclusion exemplifies the tragedy of how we deal with our transitions. We are in a massive systemic crisis, but in an ultimate effort, we are clinging towards our current polluting systems. We try to fit everything into the current revenue models. A livable future hardly comes any closer. And also the tables of the climate agreement, the Klimaatbeweging, have also fallen prey to this tyranny of the present and the current system. Let me illustrate that with an example. The climate agreement aims to replace 1.9 million fuel cars with electric cars by 2030. Quite a nice goal, you could say. But in fact, it's moving the footprint from greenhouse gas emissions to depletions of rare earth metals. Earth metals that are also mined in countries with human rights violations. It's moving the footprint rather than shrinking it. If we were to take a sustainable future really seriously, we would be committed to a system change from private car ownership to public transport, shared cars and shared bicycles. A lot more efficient for the space in our country, for the space on the electricity grid, better for emissions, and it requires fewer rare earth metals. That is truly working on a sustainable future. But such fundamental system discussions have not taken place at the climate tables of the climate agreement. Instead, the climate tables are now rushing to halve the emissions of all factories, industries and sectors by 2030, without asking ourselves the question whether all those factories and sectors should even be there in a climate-neutral 2100. And that's unwise. Because, make no mistake, halving emissions is fundamentally a different task than achieving a climate-neutral country. And not only do I think so, the Council of State also thinks so, as shown by his criticism on the climate agreement. I quote, "A major emission reduction requires not only a multitude of separate measures, but a reorganization of production and consumption in all sectors of society and economy. The climate plan, the current climate agreement, still shows very little evidence of that awareness and does not yet place the measures for 2030 enough in the perspective of 2050. End quote. With a green plate in front of our heads, we run to 2030 without laying the foundation for a livable, climate-neutral world in 2050, 2070 and 2100. With our eyes close to the ultimate goal, we stumble into the future. The tyranny of the present triumphs while the livable future loses out. And this lack of intergenerational justice in our sustainability policy is both very unwise and unjust. First of all, it's unwise. An absence of intergenerational justice results in much short-sightedness. The Dutch government has experience with this. By putting off the nitrogen problem for years, ad hoc measures costing billions have to be taken. Also, last-minute measures that cost billions were announced to achieve the Urgenda verdict. Short-sightedness and lagging behind are becoming more and more expensive. Companies also fall prey to this short-sightedness. Oil companies like Exxon and Shell, you know, the scenario champion that drafts all those future emission scenarios, they also have experience with that. Last year, they both unexpectedly had to write off a total of $14 billion in stranded assets from oil and gas reserves. It was a case of they took just too little account of the energy transition. Short-sightedness therefore also poses a risk to our pensions and then the competitiveness of our economy. But that's not the worst point that I want to talk to you about today. The most tragic thing is that in the Netherlands, we've been tempered with a system in which it has become normal. That generational justice is not a precondition, but an option. Our system has slipped so far that my generation is being told by politicians that the livability of our future may exist, provided it is feasible and affordable, provided that it's haalbaar and betaalbaar. Apparently, a viable future for our children and grandchildren is only possible under certain conditions. Apparently, the right to a healthy life is only valid when it's financially feasible and affordable. But tell me then, when will my future be affordable? And what is my future worth? What can my future cost? You know, honestly, I don't even want to know it. We didn't make such calculations during that other crisis, the COVID crisis, did we? In the COVID crisis, we shut down the economy, let go of budget rules, we pumped tens of billions of euros into the economy. We paid an average of 8 million euro per year of healthy life saved. And why? Not because a study showed that it was feasible and affordable, but because we're in solidarity with each other. Because good health is a human right. Because it would have something inhumane to discuss about it. A livable, sustainable future should be too. But somehow that future has ended up on the negotiation tables in the Netherlands. Something that's not a guarantee, but that must be fought for by parties such as the Youth Climate Movement. Lotgenoten, we can do better. What we do and don't do today determines what the world will look like in 2100. And with our improved climate models, we know more and more what our influence is on the world in 2100. So we have the obligation to take more and more responsibility for the future that we create. It is time for intergenerational justice. Intergenerational justice means that a livable future for young generations becomes a non-exchangeable, non-negotiable starting point in all policies. Intergenerational justice means that we focus on what it takes to make that livable world a reality in 2100, rather than keeping a tunnel vision on what seems possible in today's market or today's political landscape. And actually, German law has already recognized this concept. German youngsters there went to the Constitutional Court because the German climate law did not take the future sufficiently into account. There were no plans for beyond 2030. And the court confirmed that this is a violation of the Constitution because, according to the court, if the distance between the target for 2030 and the net zero target in 2050 is too great, it will require a very drastic set of measures to bridge it. It would leave a huge climate task to young generations, and that limits their freedoms. And such an imposed restriction on freedoms violates the Constitution, according to the Constitutional Court. It was a revolutionary verdict in which the court weighed the freedoms of young people in the future as much as the rights and freedoms of current generations. Intergenerational justice as a starting point. And what did German politicians do in response to the ruling? Was there a debate about political judges? No. No. The German parliament increased the climate targets within a week and is now working on a sophisticated plan for 2050 and beyond. Chancellor Merkel showed great leadership that we in the Netherlands can only dream of by concluding with the words, "Germany alone cannot change the world, but the way we do it can be an example for others to follow." Fellow companions, lotgenoten, let's agree that it does not have to come to a lawsuit in the Netherlands, but that together we can stop the stealing of the future. Let's put intergenerational justice at the root of our society, not because we have to from a judge or from the EU, but because we have the conviction that it contributes to a nicer, healthier, and more beautiful country. And we can make a start with this at companies by introducing a duty of care, so that they not only aim for good profit figures, but also for broad prosperity in 2100. To get this off the ground, I started the Committee 2100 with the Impact Economy Foundation, so that boards and commissioners don't only steer on financial figures, but also steer on broad prosperity, like health, natural capital, social capital, and human capital. That's what companies can do. And the government, in my opinion, needs a generational test for sustainability. A generational test that tests every new policy on their long-term consequences for young and future generations. Because in this way we assure that new policies really contribute to broad prosperity and flourishing in 2100. In addition, a crisis approach is needed for the climate, with an outbreak management team for the climate and a major investment agenda. But of course, you all know that. And don't forget, this shift to intergenerational justice doesn't just start at large organizations such as companies and governments. It starts everywhere. Together, we have every day the opportunity to make a difference, to keep our backs straight and to stand up for our future and that of our children. Intergenerational justice begins with the sustainable consumer movement that stops flying, and it also begins with corporate executives aligning their strategy with the 1.5-degree goal. Intergenerational justice starts with the people here in the audience, and it also starts with all employees who want to do every project just that bit more sustainably. Intergenerational justice begins with every individual who on Monday morning asks oneself the question, how am I going to contribute to the people of 2100 this week? In this way, we can demonstrate sustainable leadership together. This way, we can end the stealing of the future together, so that in the future, my children will wonder what exactly that sustainable development was that Daddy and so many others worked so hard for. Because the only development that they know is per definition sustainable. Lotgenoten, het is tijd voor generatie gerechtigheid. Thank you very much.